Have you ever stood in the silence of midnight when not a single soul is near and felt as if the weight of the world pressed down on your chest and all you could whisper was, "God, are you there?" If you've ever reached the edge of human help and found no hand to hold, this message is for you. There comes a time in every man's life when he faces a moment of terrifying stillness. The phone doesn't ring, the friends don't call, the opportunities dry up, and the silence becomes so loud it forces you to ask, is this the end or the beginning? Let me be clear. When a man has no one but God, he is not empty, he is being re-equipped. In fact, I would go so far as to say this: the most powerful moment in your life may be the one where every familiar face disappears and only your Creator remains. That moment is not your breaking, it's your awakening. Today I will share with you how history's greatest achievers, whether they were business leaders, spiritual pioneers, or humble unknowns, have all passed through this same crucible. They lost the world, but they found God, and in doing so, they found everything. Stay with me until the end of this message, because what I am about to reveal could turn your loneliness into leverage, your darkness into discipline, and your current pain into your ultimate platform. Let's begin. Adversity is not a punishment, it is a refining process, a stripping away of the superficial so that the essential may finally emerge. When a man is placed in the furnace of trial, when his comforts are taken, his allies scattered, and his plans shattered, he comes face to face with a truth he could not hear amid the noise of prosperity, that his real strength was never in the applause, never in the resources, never in the predictable. It was in the silent, unseen hand that sustained him even when he thought he was sustaining himself. The man who has walked through adversity and met God in the fire is not the same man who entered it. He has been refined, clarified, and awakened to powers he never knew he had because they were never his to begin with. Consider the story of a man who once stood at the height of success. He had influence, wealth, and a name that opened doors. But one economic crash, one betrayal, and one legal challenge later, he was bankrupt, alone, and publicly humiliated. Friends vanished. Advisors turned cold. His phone went silent. For weeks he wandered not just in financial ruin, but in the wasteland of his own mind. That's when, for the first time in years, he opened a dusty book on his nightstand, the Bible, and began to read not from obligation, but from desperation. As he read, a strange peace entered where panic had lived. He began to pray not as a formality, but as a lifeline. And in those prayers, in those late-night cries, with no one listening but God, he discovered a depth of strength, a clarity of purpose, and a surge of faith that no business school, mentor, or motivational speech had ever given him. He later rebuilt his life not just financially, but spiritually, relationally, and mentally with a foundation that could not be shaken. And he often said, "Losing everything was how I found the only thing that matters." You see, adversity introduces a man to a version of himself that comfort keeps hidden. When you are cornered by life, you are confronted with your limitations, but also invited to access divine insight. In times of plenty, people tend to rely on the seen, but in seasons of lack, they must reach for the unseen. That reaching is where the true discovery begins. When you have no more solutions of your own, you begin to tap into the infinite reservoir of divine wisdom that has always been available, but often ignored. Adversity lowers the noise of the world so that the voice of God can finally be heard. It interrupts self-sufficiency and introduces spiritual dependency. And in that dependency, a man no longer walks as a mere participant in life. He walks as a partner with the Creator of life. There is a peculiar power in isolation, a force that, when rightly understood, becomes a crucible for greatness rather than a cave of despair. When a man is cut off from the noise of social affirmation, the distractions of daily demands, and the constant pull of external expectation, he enters a rare environment, silence, and within that silence he begins to hear again not the world, but himself, not the opinions of others, but the voice of God. In solitude, the masks fall away. The posturing ceases. There's no audience to impress, no reputation to maintain. What's left is the raw man, honest, unguarded, and utterly present. It is here in this sacred space of aloneness that clarity emerges. The mind, once clouded by endless input, begins to settle like a stirred pond returning to stillness. The soul, once crowded by competing voices, finds its own frequency again. Isolation, far from being a punishment, becomes a purification, a place where illusions dissolve and truth begins to speak. Think of a man who, after years of being surrounded by people, suddenly finds himself alone, laid off from his job, divorced, his children living in another city, and his social calendar empty. At first, the silence terrifies him. He tries to fill it with noise television, scrolling phone calls to people who no longer answer. But eventually, the silence persists, and he surrenders to it. He begins to take long walks alone. He sits with journals he never had time to open before. He prays not out of duty, but because there is no one else left to talk to. Slowly, something begins to shift. The thoughts that once felt like a storm begin to align like stars in the night sky. He begins to remember passions he buried beneath years of routine. He starts to question whether the ladder he had been climbing was leaning against the wrong wall. The more time he spends in solitude, the more focused he becomes, not because life has changed, but because he has changed. In isolation, he saw what busyness had blinded him to, the difference between noise and necessity, between achievement and alignment, between success and significance. It is no accident that some of the most transformative revelations in human history came in solitude. Moses on the mountain, Jesus in the wilderness. Leaders, thinkers, visionaries, many of them stepped into their true calling not in the midst of crowds, but in the company of silence. There they were not told who to be, they discovered it. There they were not driven by ambition, but pulled by purpose. In isolation, time slows, and a man can finally examine the engine that's been running his life. Is it fear? Is it ego? Is it love? This clarity does not emerge in the clamor of daily life. It comes when everything else is stripped away. And once it comes, it cannot be undone. A man who sees clearly, even once, will never again be satisfied with blurred vision. Faith in its highest form is not merely a passive belief in unseen realities. It is an active, generating force that calls things which are not as though they were. It is the mental alchemy that transforms lack into abundance, fear into confidence, and impossibility into manifestation. Faith is the engine behind every significant achievement that first appeared foolish to the world. It begins as a conviction deep within the mind and spirit that something must exist, even if all evidence argues the contrary. It allows a man to move forward in darkness, guided not by the light of current facts, but by the illumination of inner vision. Faith gives a man permission to act boldly while still uncertain, to speak possibility when surrounded by doubt, and to labor in fields where no harvest yet grows, trusting that the harvest is already on its way. This kind of faith is not naive, it is profoundly creative. It draws from the invisible and deposits into the visible. It is the bridge between what is imagined and what is ultimately built. Take the story of a young inventor who had nothing more than an idea and a fierce conviction that it was possible. He had no investors, no background in engineering, and no credentials the world would consider valuable. But he had something greater. He had faith that what he saw in his mind was more real than the obstacles around him. Each day he sketched, studied, tested, and failed. He worked in a tiny garage with second-hand tools and borrowed parts, laughed at by those who said he was chasing dreams too big for his station. But he was not chasing a dream, he was creating from faith. Over time, his persistence bore fruit. His prototype worked. His invention gained traction. Investors began to notice. What was once an intangible hope became a tangible product, a business, and eventually an empire. Not because the path was clear, but because the belief was strong enough to cut a path where none existed. This is the essence of faith as a creative force. It moves before the way is made. It speaks before the ear can hear the echo. It acts before the result can be guaranteed. It compels a man to build the ark before there is rain, to plant seed before the soil seems fertile, to begin walking before the destination can be seen. Faith is not content to wait until circumstances are favorable. It creates favorable conditions by the sheer determination of will, vision, and spiritual alignment. When a man chooses to believe in a vision birthed within him, and when that belief is not shaken by delay or difficulty, he activates forces far beyond his own understanding. Doors begin to open, people begin to appear, solutions begin to unfold. not because he forced them, but because he believed them into existence. Faith transforms the believer into a co-creator with God, aligning his thoughts and actions with the unseen laws that govern breakthrough and success. There exists a form of guidance more precise than logic and more trustworthy than the advice of even the wisest peers. It is not heard with the ears, but felt within the soul, a whisper in the stillness, a prompting in the quiet, a certainty that rises even when circumstances scream otherwise. This is the invisible counsel of God, and it becomes most available when a man learns to tune out the world long enough to listen. In moments of great uncertainty, when the path ahead is fogged, when decisions carry heavy consequences, when resources are few and time is pressing, the natural instinct is to consult human wisdom, to gather opinions, to search externally for clarity. But often the answer a man needs is not found outside. It's within, placed there by the very one who formed him. The invisible counsel is not a lightning strike or dramatic sign. It is a quiet, firm knowing that settles into the heart like an anchor. And when a man acts on this direction, even when it contradicts what others might recommend, he begins to move with supernatural precision, guided not by sight, but by a higher knowing. Consider a man faced with a life-altering business decision. On paper, the numbers point one way. Invest in the deal, partner with the firm, take the guaranteed return. Friends confirm it. Advisors assure him. The opportunity looks perfect. But inside there is a quiet tension and unease he cannot explain. It isn't fear, but a check in his spirit, a pause that grows heavier with every attempt to push forward. For days he prays, he listens, he withdraws from the noise and waits for clarity. Then one morning, while walking alone before dawn, he hears it not audibly, but unmistakably, "Let it go." It makes no sense. It defies logic, but he obeys. He declines the offer. Months later, the firm is exposed in a scandal that would have destroyed his name, his finances, and his credibility. What spared him? Not intuition, not luck. It was the invisible counsel, the voice of God, speaking not in thunder, but in stillness. This form of guidance is available to every man, but few learn to access it because it requires surrender. It demands that he trust something beyond evidence, that he prioritize peace over pressure, and that he believe divine wisdom is not only real but accessible. The invisible counsel speaks through conviction, through alignment, through repeated impressions that grow clearer the more a man listens. And once a man begins to walk by that guidance, he no longer fears the unknown because he walks with the one who knows all. He stops chasing every opportunity and starts discerning the right ones. He moves with calm assurance even when others panic. He becomes less reactive and more intentional. He begins to operate not as a man groping through darkness, but as a guided vessel responsive to divine direction that always leads to growth, protection, and ultimate purpose. Suffering, though universally feared and instinctively avoided, holds within it the raw material for the most lasting transformation. It burns away illusion, strips away pretense, and forces a man to confront the truth of who he is and what he believes. When a man is brought low by hardship, whether it be loss, betrayal, failure, illness, or loneliness, he stands at a crossroads. He can either allow that suffering to make him bitter, broken, and small, or he can allow it to break him open, to deepen him, sharpen him, and reforge him into someone stronger than before. Pain, when rightly understood, is not just an obstacle, it is a teacher. It reveals what truly matters. It uncovers what was hiding in the recesses of the heart. It humbles the prideful and awakens the sleeping. More importantly, when suffering is surrendered to God, it becomes the very substance from which purpose is born. What once looked like ruin becomes the raw ore from which wisdom, compassion, and resilience are formed. Think of the man who lost his child, a tragedy so heavy that words could not reach its depths. For months he wandered in a fog of grief, numb to the world, questioning everything. Why? How could God allow this? Friends tried to comfort him, but nothing pierced the pain. He withdrew from the world, angry, confused, undone. But over time, in the silence of his despair, he began to hear a different kind of voice, not the voice of explanation, but the voice of presence. Not answers, but comfort. He began journaling his thoughts, not to share them, but to survive. Eventually, those journals became letters to other grieving parents, people he had never met but somehow understood. He began speaking at small grief groups, sharing not polished words but broken truth, and those words, forged in agony, carried power. They healed others. They gave hope. What had nearly destroyed him became the foundation of a new calling. His suffering did not disappear, but it was repurposed. The pain didn't go away, but it gave birth to purpose, and that purpose gave his life meaning again. This is the essence of turning suffering into substance, the willingness to bring one's pain before God, not in resentment, but in surrender, to say, I don't understand this, but I will not waste it. Suffering can harden the heart, or it can soften it into something unshakably alive. It can isolate a man or connect him deeply with the pain of others. It can make him bitter or make him wise. When a man chooses to press into his suffering rather than escape it, when he allows it to mold him rather than mangle him, he discovers that pain is not purposeless. It is packed with potential. Every scar becomes a testimony, every wound a doorway to greater depth. He emerges not as someone merely who survived, but someone who has substance, a weight to his words, a fire in his faith, and a steadiness in his stride that cannot be faked, imitated, or bought. There is no force more compelling in a man's life than definite purpose, clear, unwavering, soul-rooted intent. When that purpose is not merely self-imposed, but divinely aligned, it becomes a partnership between man and the Creator of all things. A man with a definite purpose, guided by divine wisdom, becomes unstoppable, not because he never encounters resistance, but because he is no longer driven by mere ambition. He is led by assignment. Purpose sharpens the mind, fuels endurance, and filters distractions. It gives every action weight, every setback meaning, and every victory significance. But purpose, when it is merely self-generated, can falter under pressure. When tied to ego, it cracks. When built on self-interest alone, it collapses. True power emerges when that purpose is not born from personal gain, but ignited by a divine calling. That's when a man stops chasing results and starts fulfilling destiny. He becomes a vessel through which something greater flows. Imagine a man who spent years climbing the ladder in a corporate career, high pay, prestige, promotions. On the surface, he was the picture of success, but something inside remained unsettled. Despite the accolades, his work felt hollow. Then came a breaking point, an unexpected termination that shattered his identity. At first, he spiraled into depression, questioning his value. But in that quiet space, he began to seek something deeper. He spent months reflecting, praying, listening not to the market, but to God. In that period of stillness, a new vision began to form. He remembered a burden he had carried since youth, to mentor troubled young men. It had always seemed impractical, too far removed from his path. But now, with nothing to lose and a stirring he could no longer ignore, he acted. He launched a small mentorship program in his community, just a few boys, a rented room, and a borrowed van. What began as a fragile act of obedience soon exploded into something far bigger than he had imagined. Donations came. Volunteers joined. Media noticed. Within a few years, it grew into a nationally recognized initiative changing lives across the country. The difference? This time, he wasn't just working, he was walking in purpose. And that purpose wasn't his idea alone, it was divine partnership. This is the transformative power of definite purpose aligned with God. It gives a man clarity in chaos and strength in weakness. He no longer needs to hustle for validation or scramble for relevance. He moves with a quiet confidence because he knows who sent him and why he was sent. Obstacles no longer shake him the same way they refine him but do not derail him. Every day becomes intentional. Every encounter carries weight. Every challenge becomes part of the process. The man operating in divine partnership does not rely solely on his own intellect or ability. He leans on wisdom higher than his own, strength beyond his capacity, and timing more perfect than his planning. He becomes an instrument, not just an individual. He stops asking, what do I want to do? And starts asking, what was I born to build? That shift changes everything. Purpose becomes a compass. God becomes the strategist. And together they create outcomes no human effort alone could ever achieve.